March 15, 1945. The island of Okinawa trembles under a sky that rains fire instead of water, where American bombers paint the horizon with explosions that can be felt in your bones from miles away. But this story doesn't begin in the chaos of battle. It begins in the silence that follows, in a moment so impossible that even war itself seems to pause in disbelief. Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Morrison lies broken on a hospital stretcher, his B-24 Liberator scattered across a rice field somewhere behind enemy lines. 3 hours ago, he was dropping bombs on Japanese positions. 3 hours ago, the woman now cleaning blood from his face was his enemy. 3 hours ago, the world made sense in the simple, brutal way that war demands: us versus them, kill or be killed, victory or death. Now Jimmy stares up at dark eyes that should hate him, hands that should let him die, a voice speaking words he doesn't understand but somehow recognizes as gentle, caring, impossibly kind. The woman leaning over him wears a white nurse's uniform stained with blood and dirt, her black hair pulled back in a way that reveals a face that could belong to any young woman in any peaceful time, if such time still existed. Her name is Akiko Tanaka, though Jimmy doesn't know this yet. He doesn't know that she's 23 years old, that she trained as a nurse in Tokyo before the war consumed everything, that she's been working 18-hour shifts in this bombed-out hospital for 6 months without a single day of rest. He doesn't know that her brother died at Pearl Harbor, that her father was killed in a bombing raid on Kyoto, that she has every reason in the world to let this American pilot bleed to death on the floor of what used to be Okinawa General Hospital. What he does know, with the clarity that comes only in moments of absolute vulnerability, is that she's saving his life. Akiko moves with practiced efficiency around Jimmy's broken body, her hands gentle despite the urgency of his condition. His left leg is shattered, twisted at an angle that makes her wince with professional concern. Shrapnel has torn through his flight suit, leaving wounds that weep blood onto the hospital's makeshift operating table. But it's his eyes that capture her attention, blue eyes that stare at her with a mixture of confusion, gratitude, and something else she can't quite identify. Fear. No, not fear. Jimmy Morrison has been flying bombing missions over the Pacific for 8 months. His face-down fighter planes and flak fields and the constant knowledge that any mission could be his last. Fear is an old companion, familiar and manageable. This is something else entirely. This is the vertigo that comes from having your entire understanding of reality shifted in an instant. Because Akiko Tanaka, this Japanese nurse with blood on her uniform and gentleness in her touch, is not supposed to exist in Jimmy's version of the world. The Japanese, according to his briefings, according to the propaganda posters, according to everything he's been told since December 7, 1941, are inhuman monsters who deserve nothing but destruction. They don't save American lives. They don't have soft hands and worried expressions. They don't lean over enemy soldiers and whisper what sounds suspiciously like prayers. But here she is, defying every assumption, challenging every certainty, making Jimmy question not just who his enemies are, but who he is himself. The hospital around them tells its own story of impossible contradictions. What was once a modern medical facility is now a maze of broken walls and improvised treatment areas, where Japanese doctors work alongside captured American medics, where enemy soldiers lie on stretchers next to each other, separated not by nationality but simply by the severity of their wounds. War has a way of stripping away everything except the most essential truths, and the most essential truth in this place is that pain doesn't care what flag you salute, that suffering doesn't recognize borders, that the need for healing transcends every division human beings create between themselves. Dr. Hiroshi Yamamoto, the chief surgeon, notices the way Akiko lingers over the American pilot's bedside. Yamamoto is a man who has seen too much in his 63 years, who remembers when American and Japanese doctors trained together in medical schools, when healing was a profession that brought people together rather than another front in an endless war. He says nothing about Akiko's attention to the enemy pilot, partly because they need every pair of hands they can get, partly because he recognizes something in her manner that reminds him of why he became a doctor in the first place. "The American will live," Yamamoto tells Akiko in quiet Japanese, his voice carrying both professional assessment and something that might be approval. "Thanks to your quick work. The leg will heal, though he'll walk with a limp. The shrapnel wounds are clean. He's young and strong." Akiko nods, not trusting herself to speak. She doesn't understand why this particular patient affects her so deeply, why she finds herself checking on him more often than medical necessity requires, why she feels a strange tightness in her chest when she thinks about him being transferred to a prisoner of war camp once he's stable enough to move. Jimmy drifts in and out of consciousness over the next 2 days, fever dreams mixing with moments of startling clarity. Sometimes he's back in his bomber, feeling the familiar vibration of 4 engines carrying him toward another target. Sometimes he's home in Iowa, sitting at his mother's kitchen table while she worries about her son fighting a war on the other side of the world. And sometimes he's here, in this broken hospital, watching a Japanese nurse move between patients with a combination of professional skill and personal compassion that challenges everything he thought he knew about the people he's been trained to kill. During his lucid moments, Jimmy tries to understand his situation. He's a prisoner, obviously, though he's being treated better than many American POWs according to the stories he's heard. The hospital staff seem genuinely committed to healing rather than punishment, though he notices the way some of the Japanese soldiers look at him with undisguised hatred. He can't blame them. How many of their friends has he killed from 20,000 feet? How many of their homes has he helped destroy? But when Akiko approaches his bed, hatred seems to evaporate like morning mist. She moves with purpose but without hostility, checking his wounds, adjusting his blankets, offering him water with the same care she shows Japanese patients. More than once, Jimmy catches her looking at him with an expression he can't quite interpret, something that might be curiosity, or concern, or something else entirely. On his 3rd day in the hospital, Jimmy wakes to find Akiko sitting beside his bed, not working but simply sitting, her hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes fixed on something outside the bombed-out window. The morning light catches her profile in a way that makes Jimmy's breath catch, not because she's beautiful, though she is, but because she looks so utterly human, so completely ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. "You're awake," she says in careful English, the words heavily accented but unmistakably clear. Jimmy stares at her, shocked not just by the fact that she speaks his language, but by the way she says it, with a gentle concern that seems to reach across every divide that should separate them. "You speak English," he says, his voice rough from disuse. Akiko nods, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I studied at University of California before the war. 2 years in Los Angeles, studying to be a nurse. I was supposed to return to Japan for 6 months, to visit my family. Then Pearl Harbor happened." She pauses, her smile fading. "I have been trying to get home ever since." The revelation hits Jimmy like a physical blow. This woman, this enemy who has been caring for him with such tenderness, knows his country better than he knows hers. She's walked the same streets he's walked, breathed the same air, probably ate hamburgers and watched Hollywood movies and did all the ordinary things that make up an American life. She was, for 2 years, more American than many Americans, pursuing a dream of healing that knew no borders. Los Angeles, Jimmy repeats, trying to wrap his mind around this impossible coincidence. "I'm from Iowa, but I trained in California. Flew out of March Field before they shipped us to the Pacific." "March Field," Akiko says, her eyes widening slightly. "I know this place. I had friends who lived in Riverside. We would picnic sometimes near the base, listen to the planes taking off." She looks at him with something that might be wonder. "Perhaps I heard your plane, before we became enemies." The thought hangs between them like a bridge spanning an impossible distance. How many times had their lives almost intersected before this moment? How many near misses, how many parallel paths that never quite touched until war brought them together in the most unlikely way possible? Jimmy struggles to process this revelation, to reconcile the propaganda image of faceless Japanese enemies with this young woman who picnicked near American air bases, who dreamed of healing people regardless of their nationality, who chose to save his life when she could have let him die. The cognitive dissonance is almost overwhelming, like trying to hold two contradictory truths in his mind simultaneously. Why? He asks finally, the question encompassing everything he can't understand about his situation, about her kindness, about the impossibility of finding compassion in the middle of hatred. Akiko understands what he's really asking. Why did she save him? Why does she care what happens to an enemy pilot? Why does she sit beside his bed and speak to him in his own language when she should hate everything he represents? Because, she says simply, you are not my enemy. You are someone's son, someone's hope, someone's love. You are hurt, and I am a nurse. This is enough. Her words hit Jimmy with the force of revelation, stripping away months of conditioning, years of propaganda, the entire structure of beliefs that allowed him to drop bombs on people he never saw, never knew, never thought of as completely human. In Akiko's simple statement, he hears an echo of something his mother used to say, something about treating others the way you hope to be treated, something about love being stronger than hate if you just give it a chance. But Jimmy Morrison is still an American pilot, still technically a prisoner of war, still part of a massive military machine bent on destroying everything Akiko holds dear. And Akiko Tanaka is still Japanese, still officially his enemy, still part of a nation that his country has sworn to defeat at any cost. The tenderness growing between them exists in defiance of everything logical, everything safe, everything that the world expects from people in their positions. As the days pass and Jimmy's strength returns, both of them begin to realize that they're walking toward a cliff edge, that what started as simple human compassion is evolving into something more dangerous, more forbidden, more impossible than either of them ever imagined. They're falling in love in the middle of a war that demands they hate each other, and neither of them knows how this story can possibly end in anything other than heartbreak. But love, like music, like healing, like all the best parts of human nature, doesn't ask permission from politicians or generals or the architects of hatred. It simply exists, patient and persistent, waiting for hearts brave enough to choose connection over division, hope over fear, and the radical possibility that enemies can become something else entirely if they're willing to see each other as human beings first and everything else second. 1 week into Jimmy's recovery, the impossible happens again. Not a dramatic rescue or miraculous healing, but something far more dangerous to the carefully maintained boundaries of war, routine. Akiko brings him rice soup every morning at 7. Jimmy teaches her American slang during the afternoon medical rounds. They discover shared memories of California sunshine, of movies they both saw, of a world that existed before Pearl Harbor divided their lives into before and after. Dr. Yamamoto watches this developing friendship with the complicated emotions of a man who remembers peace. He was 38 when the war began, old enough to remember when Japanese and American medical journals were exchanged freely, when healing was a profession that transcended nationality. Young enough to understand the loneliness that drives two people together even when everything else pulls them apart. Akiko-san, he says one evening as she finishes her shift, using the formal address that maintains professional distance while acknowledging personal concern. The American pilot is healing well, perhaps too well for his own safety. Akiko knows exactly what Dr. Yamamoto means, but she pretends not to understand. His leg is mending properly. The infection has cleared. His strength returns each day. That is not the healing I speak of, and you know this. Yamamoto's voice carries the weight of a father's concern, though he has no children of his own, lost his wife in the Tokyo firebombings, has nothing left except his dedication to preserving life in the middle of machinery designed to destroy it. What grows between you and the American is dangerous for both of you. Akiko's cheeks flush, but she doesn't deny what they both know to be true. He is kind, Yamamoto-sensei. He speaks to me of his home, of his family. He asks about mine. When did kindness become dangerous? When it grows between enemies during wartime, Yamamoto replies, though his voice lacks the harshness his words might suggest. You know what will happen to him when he is strong enough to be transferred. You know what will happen to you if anyone believes you have become too attached to an enemy. The unspoken threat hangs between them like smoke. Collaboration with the enemy, real or perceived, carries consequences that neither of them wants to contemplate. But Yamamoto also knows something else about human nature, about the way hope finds a foothold even in the most hostile ground, about the impossibility of legislating what the heart chooses to feel. That night, Akiko sits beside Jimmy's bed longer than usual, their conversation meandering through topics both profound and mundane. Jimmy tells her about Iowa winters, about cornfields that stretch to the horizon, about his mother's apple pie and his father's stories about the First War, the one that was supposed to end all wars. Akiko describes cherry blossom season in Kyoto, the way the petals fall like snow in April, the sound of temple bells across the ancient city, the feeling of continuity that connects her to generations of ancestors who never imagined a world where Americans and Japanese would try to destroy each other. Do you think, Jimmy asks during a pause in their conversation, that if we had met in Los Angeles before all this madness started, we could have been friends? Akiko considers the question seriously, imagining a world where they might have encountered each other at USC, where she might have been studying nursing while he pursued whatever dreams brought him to California. More than friends, perhaps, she says quietly, the admission surprising them both with its honesty. Jimmy's hand moves almost without his conscious direction, covering hers where it rests on the blanket beside him. The touch is electric, not with passion but with recognition, with the stunning realization that this connection they feel is mutual, that the impossibility they're walking toward is something they're walking toward together. Akiko, he says, her name feeling natural on his tongue despite the foreignness of its syllables. What happens when I'm well enough to leave here? She doesn't answer immediately, because they both know the answer, and neither wants to speak it aloud. Jimmy will be transferred to a prisoner of war camp, if he's lucky. If he's unlucky, if someone decides he's too dangerous or too valuable for intelligence purposes, his fate could be far worse. And Akiko will remain here, tending to other wounded soldiers, carrying the memory of this impossible connection like a secret that could destroy her if anyone ever discovered how deeply it has affected her. I don't know, she says finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I know only that I will miss our conversations. I will miss your stories about Iowa, your terrible jokes in broken Japanese, the way you look at me like I am not your enemy but simply myself. Jimmy's grip on her hand tightens slightly. You are not my enemy, Akiko. I don't think you ever were, even when I was supposed to believe you were. You're the most genuinely good person I've ever met, and if this war has taught me anything, it's that good people are rare and precious and should be protected, not destroyed. The weight of his words settles between them like a promise, like a commitment to something that transcends the circumstances that brought them together. Neither of them speaks of love, not yet, but both recognize that they've crossed some invisible line, that what started as professional care and human kindness has evolved into something that will mark them both for the rest of their lives, however long or short those lives might be. 2 days later, everything changes. Jimmy wakes before dawn to the sound of urgent voices speaking rapid Japanese. Through the broken windows of the hospital, he can see movement in the darkness, trucks and soldiers and the unmistakable signs of military activity. Akiko appears at his bedside, her face tight with controlled fear, her movements quick and efficient as she helps him sit up. What's happening? Jimmy asks, though part of him already knows, has been expecting this moment since he first opened his eyes in this place that exists outside the normal rules of war. American forces, Akiko says, her voice steady despite the chaos building around them. They have broken through the Japanese lines. They will be here by morning, perhaps sooner. The hospital is being evacuated. Jimmy's heart pounds, but not with the relief he expected to feel at the prospect of rescue. Instead, he feels something closer to panic, because rescue means separation, means returning to a world where Akiko Tanaka is once again the enemy, where the connection they've built exists only in his memory, where loving her becomes not just impossible but treasonous. "What about you?" he asks, struggling to get out of bed despite the protests of his healing leg. "What about the patients who can't be moved?" Akiko's composure cracks slightly. "The staff will remain. We cannot abandon those who need us." "But Jimmy." She uses his first name for the first time, and hearing it from her lips is both wonderful and heartbreaking. "When the American soldiers arrive, you must not tell them that Japanese medical staff cared for you. You must not mention that we spoke, that we became friends. It would be dangerous for all of us." The implication hits Jimmy like a physical blow. Not only must he lose her, but he must pretend she never existed, must deny the very connection that has become the most meaningful relationship of his life. He must return to his squadron, to his mission of destroying everything she represents, and act as if the woman who saved his life and touched his heart was nothing more than an enemy medic doing her job. "I can't do that," Jimmy says, reaching for her hand. "I can't pretend that this didn't happen, that you don't matter, that what I feel for you isn't real." "You must," Akiko insists, though her own voice wavers with emotion. "Because if you don't, if anyone suspects that there was something between us, they will use it as propaganda. They will say that Japanese medical staff seduced American prisoners, that our care was manipulation rather than healing. They will court-martial you for collaboration. They will execute me for treason." The stark reality of their situation crystallizes in that moment. Their love, if they can call it that, exists in a space that neither of their worlds will acknowledge or accept. It's beautiful and pure and completely doomed, like a flower blooming in the middle of a battlefield, destined to be destroyed by forces far larger than itself. Jimmy pulls himself to his feet, ignoring the pain in his leg, and takes Akiko's face in his hands. For a moment that lasts forever, they look at each other with the intensity of people memorizing something precious that they know they're about to lose. "I will remember," Jimmy says, his voice rough with emotion. "Every conversation, every kindness, every moment of this impossible thing between us. I will remember until the day I die, and I will carry you with me wherever I go." Akiko's eyes fill with tears, but she doesn't look away. "And I will remember the American pilot who taught me that enemies can become something else, who showed me that love is possible even in the middle of hatred, even when the world says it's forbidden." They kiss then, just once, a kiss that tastes of goodbye and what might have been, of love discovered and love lost, of two people who found each other across an impossible divide only to discover that some divisions cannot be crossed, no matter how much courage you bring to the attempt. The sound of American voices grows closer, carried on the morning wind like an announcement of the end. Jimmy and Akiko separate, both understanding that this is the last moment they will share, the last time they will be simply two people who care for each other rather than representatives of nations at war. "Go," Akiko whispers, stepping back from him. "Go and live, and be happy, and know that somewhere in the world, someone understood who you really are beneath the uniform." Jimmy limps toward the sound of approaching American forces, each step taking him further from the only woman who has ever seen his heart clearly, who has ever made him question everything he thought he knew about right and wrong, about duty and love, about what it means to be truly human in an inhuman world. Behind him, Akiko watches until he disappears around a corner, then turns back to her patients, to her duty, to a life that will forever be marked by the memory of 10 days when love proved stronger than war, if only briefly, if only in the quiet spaces between battles where miracles sometimes happen if you're brave enough to believe in them. Lieutenant Jimmy Morrison is rescued at 0800 hours on March 27, 1945, by the 96th Infantry Division of the United States Army. The official report states that he was found in an abandoned Japanese field hospital, suffering from injuries sustained when his aircraft was shot down 12 days earlier. The report makes no mention of the Japanese medical staff who saved his life, no reference to the nurse who sat beside his bed and taught him that enemies could choose to heal rather than harm. Jimmy tells the debriefing officers exactly what they expect to hear, that he was unconscious for most of his captivity, that he received minimal medical care, that he learned nothing of intelligence value about Japanese positions or capabilities. It's all lies, every word of it, but Jimmy has learned something about himself during his time in that broken hospital. He has learned that some truths are too precious to share with people who would use them as weapons. The army doctors are amazed by how well his injuries have healed. The broken leg was set with professional skill, the shrapnel wounds cleaned and sutured with precision that speaks of genuine medical training. "Whoever patched you up knew what they were doing," the chief medical officer remarks. "Lucky for you, the Japs had a decent field surgeon." Jimmy nods and says nothing about gentle hands and worried eyes, about conversations conducted in whispered English and careful Japanese, about the way someone can save your life not just with medical skill but with simple human kindness. Some stories, he realizes, are too important to tell to people who wouldn't understand their meaning. 2 weeks later, Jimmy is back in the cockpit, flying missions over Japanese positions, dropping bombs on targets that might include the very hospital where he learned that love doesn't ask permission from politicians or generals. The irony tastes like ashes in his mouth, but war is a machine that consumes everything, including the connections that remind us why peace is worth fighting for. But Jimmy carries a Kiko with him in ways that his fellow pilots notice, even if they don't understand. He's more careful about civilian targets, more questioning of intelligence reports that seem to assume all Japanese are fanatics willing to die for the emperor. During briefings, he asks pointed questions about medical facilities, about evacuation routes for non-combatants, about rules of engagement that might spare innocent lives. Morrison's getting soft, some of the younger pilots whisper, not understanding that Jimmy has simply learned to see Japanese faces when he looks through his bomb sight, to remember that every target contains people who might have mothers who sang lullabies, fathers who told stories, nurses who chose healing over hatred even when hatred would have been easier. Captain Robert Hayes, Jimmy's squadron commander, notices the change in his pilot's attitude. Hayes is a career military man who has learned to read people the way others read weather patterns, and what he sees in Jimmy Morrison troubles him. Not cowardice. Jimmy still flies every mission assigned to him with professional competence. Not shell shock. His hands remain steady, his judgment sound. But something has shifted in Morrison's approach to the war, some fundamental change in perspective that Hayes can't quite identify. "You doing okay, Morrison?" Hayes asks one evening as they sit in the officers' club, nursing beers that taste like recycled water and trying to forget another day of dealing death from 20,000 feet. "You seem different since you got back." Jimmy considers his answer carefully. How do you explain to a man who has spent 3 years learning to hate the enemy that you've discovered the enemy might not be who you thought they were? How do you describe falling in love with someone you're supposed to kill without sounding like you've lost your mind or your patriotism? "Just thinking about after," Jimmy says finally. "About what we're going to do when this is all over, what kind of world we're fighting to create." Hayes nods, recognizing the sentiment even if he doesn't share it. "Best thing you can do is focus on ending it as quick as possible. The sooner we beat the Japs, the sooner we all go home." But Jimmy knows now that beating the Japs isn't simple mathematics, that every bomb he drops might destroy something precious, someone irreplaceable, some small miracle of human decency that the world desperately needs to remember how to create. He thinks of Akiko working in her bombed-out hospital, tending to wounded soldiers regardless of their nationality, and wonders if she's still alive, still choosing compassion over vengeance, still proving that love is possible even when everything else seems impossible. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles away on Okinawa, Akiko Tanaka continues her work in what remains of the field hospital. The building has been hit twice more since Jimmy's rescue, and each bombing raid forces them to move their patients to caves, to abandoned houses, to anywhere they can find shelter and continue the work of healing. She doesn't know if the bombs falling around her come from Jimmy's squadron, doesn't want to know, because that knowledge would make the irony too painful to bear. But she thinks of him often, especially during the quiet moments between crises when her hands are finally still and her mind can wander to memories of Iowa cornfields and gentle blue eyes and the way he said her name like it was something precious. She wonders if he made it safely back to his unit, if he's still flying, if he ever thinks about the Japanese nurse who discovered that American pilots could be kind, thoughtful, funny, heartbreakingly human beneath their bomber jackets. Dr. Yamamoto notices that Akiko has changed since the American pilot's departure. She's more thoughtful, more introspective, as if she's carrying some internal conversation that never quite reaches a conclusion. But she's also more determined, more focused on her work, as if she's trying to prove something to herself or to the memory of someone who isn't there to see it. "You miss him," Yamamoto says one evening, not as an accusation but as a simple observation of fact. Akiko doesn't deny it. "I miss the conversations. I miss having someone to talk with about the world beyond this war, about possibilities that exist outside of hatred and destruction." "And do you think he misses you as well?" Akiko is quiet for a long moment, cleaning medical instruments with the mechanical precision that comes from months of practice. "I think he remembers me," she says finally. "I think sometimes, when he's flying over places like this, he remembers that there are people here who choose healing instead of hatred. And perhaps that memory makes him careful." She's more right than she knows. Jimmy has become the most reluctant bomber in his squadron, a pilot who follows orders but questions targets, who drops his ordnance with scientific precision but spends sleepless nights wondering about the faces of people he'll never see, people who might have been his friends in a different world, a different time. The war grinds on through spring and into summer, and both Jimmy and Akiko settle into their new normal, carrying each other's memory like a secret, a reminder that connection is possible even across the greatest divides, that love doesn't ask permission from the architects of hatred, that some truths are too important to share and too precious to forget. Then, on August 6, 1945, everything changes again. Jimmy is in briefing when the news comes through, a new type of bomb, dropped on a city called Hiroshima, destruction on a scale that defies comprehension. The room erupts in celebration, in speculation about whether this means the war is finally ending, whether they'll all be going home sooner than expected. But Jimmy feels only horror, not at American ingenuity or Japanese suffering, but at the scope of indiscriminate destruction, at the impossibility of surgical precision when entire cities disappear in single flashes of light. How many hospitals were in Hiroshima? How many nurses choosing healing over hatred? How many gentle hands and kind eyes turned to ash in an instant? 3 days later comes news of Nagasaki, and then, mercifully, impossibly, the Emperor's surrender broadcast on August 15th. The war is over. Jimmy Morrison can stop dropping bombs on people who might have been his friends. Akiko Tanaka can stop treating wounds inflicted by people who might have understood her heart, if circumstances had been different. But victory feels hollow to both of them, tainted by the knowledge of what was lost along the way, by the recognition that some battles are won at costs too high to celebrate. The world they're returning to is scarred by more than bombed cities and refugee camps. It's marked by the realization that ordinary people can be transformed into enemies by nothing more than propaganda and fear, and that the capacity for both love and hatred exists in every human heart. Jimmy spends his last month in the Pacific Theater helping with reconstruction efforts, working alongside former enemies to rebuild what war destroyed. He never stops looking for familiar faces, never stops hoping that somehow, impossibly, he might encounter a Japanese nurse who once sat beside his bed and talked about cherry blossoms and California sunshine. Akiko works in the refugee camps that spring up around Okinawa, tending to displaced civilians and former soldiers alike, American and Japanese side by side in the strange equality of shared suffering. She never stops listening for a particular voice among the American relief workers, never stops hoping that somehow fate might bring them together again, even though she knows such reunions exist only in stories that end more happily than real life usually allows. They never find each other again, but they carry each other forward into the peace that follows, into lives shaped by the knowledge that enemies can become something else if they choose to see each other clearly, that love is possible even in the middle of hatred, that healing is stronger than destruction if you're brave enough to believe in it. Jimmy returns to Iowa and becomes a doctor, specializing in trauma surgery, motivated by memories of gentle hands and professional competence that saved his life when he least expected salvation. He marries a nurse named Catherine who reminds him sometimes of kindness he once knew, and he tells her stories about the war that are mostly true, leaving out only the parts too precious to share with anyone who wasn't there to understand their meaning. Akiko eventually makes her way to America, to Los Angeles where she once studied, where dreams of healing transcended nationality before Pearl Harbor divided the world into sides. She works in a hospital that treats veterans of the Pacific Theater, American soldiers who return home carrying wounds both visible and invisible, and sometimes she recognizes something in their eyes that reminds her of Blue Eyes and Iowa stories and 10 Days when love proved stronger than war. They live their separate lives, productive and meaningful and marked by compassion learned in the most unlikely classroom. They never meet again, never write letters, never attempt to bridge the distance that war created between them. But they never forget each other either, never stop carrying the memory of what was possible, even briefly, even in the middle of madness. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the world seems particularly divided, when hatred appears stronger than hope, they remember that once, in a bombed-out hospital on a small island in the Pacific, an American pilot and a Japanese nurse discovered that love doesn't ask permission from politicians, that healing transcends nationality, that enemies can become something else entirely if they're willing to see each other as human beings first and everything else second. It's a small story, lost in the vast narrative of global conflict, invisible to historians who measure victory in terms of territory gained and battles won. But it's also a true story, in the way that the most important truths are always personal, always intimate, always about the choice that individual hearts make to connect rather than divide, to heal rather than harm, to love rather than hate, even when the world insists that such choices are impossible. In the end, that's the victory that matters most, not the defeat of nations or the conquest of territories, but the quiet triumph of two people who found each other across an impossible divide and chose to remember that enemies can become friends, strangers can become beloved, and love can bloom even in the ashes of war if you're brave enough to tend it, protect it, and carry it forward into whatever peace you can create.